Okay, so like the title says, this is just a perspective on the thing, okay? And but the thing is it's a perspective that's been written down, which is quite a lot different from one that hasn't. Because it gives me the opportunity to read aloud what I've thought through. But there is a problem, and that's that I could start sounding as though I'm reading aloud, which I'll endeavor not to do. Okay, so now quoting from the text. As nervous as he had a right to be, I contend that Trudeau and his cabinet knew there was no reason to invoke the Emergencies Act. So that's new. Have you heard anybody say that? Right? I don't think I have. So this is good already. Trudeau and his cabinet knew there was no reason to invoke the Emergencies Act. That's what I think. The event was organized by the truckers and the police, who worked together quite successfully to keep the event safe. Parliamentarians had been strolling through the protest for weeks without serious incident. He knew that a deal had been struck with the truckers, and they were already leaving the residential areas. They were tired, probably close to broke, and simply wanted to go home. He could have ended it by simply offering to listen, by being a leader. The whole world was watching. The truckers obviously had a lot of heartfelt support, the kind that raises $10 million in small donations twice in like 2 weeks. No. The truckers deserved to be listened to after having invested so much in terms of time, energy, money to be there. Instead, he invoked the act for the gratification of himself and his base. That's what I think. He thought that by coming down on them, he would get people to go, "Oh, Trudeau, you're our guy. You crack down on those guys." Everything they do is for votes, obviously. He's desperate to hang on to power, probably now. I don't know. I'm sorry. Well, I think that has legal complications if he's no longer prime minister, I think. So, yeah, who knows? Anyway, I think that he invoked the act for the gratification of himself and his base, and that they wanted to see people with unacceptable views brought to heel. That probably felt good for them, right? People do things because they think it would feel good. That would feel good to them. And then people would vote for him for it. His intention was to intimidate the truckers and their supporters. In retrospect, that's funny, but especially now it is, now that Trudeau and his cabinet are the subject of a public inquiry. One tasked with deciding if the invocation of the act was justified legally or ethically. If it wasn't, the implication is that the government behaved much like a dictatorship. He ignored and insulted the protesters. He provoked them. He used agents of the state to intimidate his political opponents, froze bank accounts. The police violently ended a largely peaceful and very important protest. Tamara Lich was arrested, and she's kind of the heart and soul of the movement, was arrested under a countrywide warrant, shackled like the worst kind of criminal. Okay, so by contrast, we've gone in here only 3 minutes. Okay. By contrast, check this: the Freedom Convoy Code of Conduct. In the event of violence or threat of violence, disengage and inform an officer. Be kind and respectful towards your fellow Canadians and international supporters. We're working with authorities to help ensure public safety. We ask that all individuals be on their best behavior while spreading the message of unity, love, and forgiveness. The Canada Unity Freedom Convoy condemns all hate symbols. Individuals who are expressing messages of hate and division are not members of the Bear Hug movement. I wonder how many of the convoy's critics knew that it was called the Bear Hug movement. This overreaction will cost him votes and hurt his image both in Canada and around the world, because few good people have a positive view of politicians who demonize, intimidate, and suppress their political opponents. Not unless he's going to hang around with sleazeballs, which he probably already does. By contrast, the truckers, well, they invested their own money, time, energy, and resources to protest what they understood to be an increasingly authoritarian government. The mandates were just the straw that broke the camel's back. It was a lot. It was about that, but it's about a lot more than that, and that is absolutely certain. Whether you agree with their assessment is another issue. They thought they were fighting tyranny, and for reasons that will be listed here. They are deserving of a lot of gratitude and admiration, in my humble opinion. If not for them, the Trudeau government would not be on the hot seat right now. Sorry about this, but they would be deserving of a great deal more appreciation, however, if they had not honked their horns so incessantly. That was selfish and idiotic. No wonder citizens of Ottawa were frightened and angry. Does this lapse define the movement? Not for me, obviously, but the honking and the border closures are a stain. Aggression is a mistake. Commit absolutely to nonviolence, except in self-defense. And let us not forget these lessons. We may be needing them again sooner than we think. So this is almost like a series of vignettes or something. It's not exactly... Anyway, it's what I've written. The public inquiry into Trudeau's invocation of the Emergencies Act is an incredibly exciting, important, and probably pivotal moment in Canadian history. It will set a precedent for how the Act might be used or abused in the future by this or succeeding governments. This is our chance to hold this government accountable and send potential tyrants a warning. It would be foolish beyond words to not take advantage of it. And I know that this is overblown vocabulary, but this vocabulary does get to the essence of what we're talking about. This is our chance to hold this government accountable and send potential tyrants a warning. It would be foolish beyond words to not take advantage of it. Justice must be seen to have been done. If the elite class of journalists and politicians seeks to minimize the severity of this abuse of power, a sizable and growing number of Canadians will come even that much closer than they already are to the conclusion that the entire class is totally corrupt and untrustworthy. That could be destabilizing to the country in the short time, but could at least cement Justin's demise as Prime Minister of Canada. Heaven forbid that he be elected again. How many minutes we in? Okay, 8 minutes. Wow. Okay, here are the main reasons we have for believing that the invocation was unjustified. Most will probably be familiar to you. Okay, number one, people like Brian Peckford, the sole surviving author of the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, have serious concerns. People like him. For example, Perrin Betty, one of the principal authors of the Emergencies Act itself, he appears to have serious reservations. And when he finally says his thing, it's going to be devastating. That's it. Perrin Beatty, he's an interesting guy to watch on this. The Civil Liberties Association has lawsuits pending, as does the Justice Center for Constitutional Freedoms, led by Keith Wilson. These are not bit players. They would not be involved if they were not convinced they had a solid case. So, do I think it was unjustified? What reason do I have? Well, because these people think it was unjustified. That's a really good indication, because they know stuff and we don't know stuff. So if it's not in itself any proof at all. That's the thing. It's not in itself any proof at all. It doesn't mean anything. That doesn't mean that I would take it like nothing. Perhaps I'm confused. Okay, in any case, we don't think that it was justified because there was no serious emergency. The border blockades had already come down, and trucks had already begun leaving the residential areas of Ottawa. Some for other areas out of town, and some for Wellington, as per the agreement made with the police. Many of the truckers just wanted to go home and were persuaded simply by having been listened to for the first time. This is the story. This is the narrative. This is what happened. That the guy that negotiated with them, I have to find his name, said, yeah, they just wanted somebody to finally listen to them. And then they started to go home. Believe that. Okay, they just wanted to be listened to. That's what the mediator between Tamara Litch and the Ottawa police said. Something French, I think is his name. Had they been listened to at the outset, the protests would very likely have been less intense and of shorter duration. Trudeau's actions intensified and prolonged them. Unfortunate for many citizens of Ottawa. They should sue him. The RCMP decision to arrest Tamara Litch under a countrywide warrant, usually reserved for the worst criminals, probably didn't help either. So you could say that the government had been antagonizing this group of people for some time. But again, got to admit, the horns were a really bad idea. It gave the government a reason to bring in the act, for one thing. You might not have had the act if it wasn't for the horn. I believe the people who felt harassed, frightened, and angered by such inconsiderate behavior. They deserve an apology and reasonable compensation. Which takes us away from the main point. I'm listing the reasons why we don't think he was justified, right? Number one, all those smart guys said that it's not justified. Number two is there's got to at least be an emergency. We're not sure that there even was one. And the other thing is that it has to be a serious emergency that can't be dealt with in any other way. And that's not true either. So whatever emergency that did exist, this is number three, had already been largely dealt with without the special powers granted by the Act. The truckers were leaving as agreed. The protests in front of the Parliament buildings were for the most part well-behaved, tidy and festive. They had a legitimate set of grievances and a right to be there. In any case, the officer in charge of clearing the area, Patricia Ferguson, has given her testimony and really did not seem to think that the Emergency Act helped much. The police already had a plan and the personnel in place. She did mention that it was useful to threaten to freeze truckers' bank accounts. In response to a protest against his tyranny, Trudeau resorted to his most authoritarian act yet, which is the invocation of the Emergencies Act. So what I've written here is the act can only be used if the threat is severe and police powers are not adequate to deal with it. Neither threshold was met. Okay, number four, no law enforcement organization asked for the act, contrary to what the government claimed. There was no espionage or support of espionage, sabotage or support of sabotage, foreign influence that involved a threat to any person or acts of serious violence against ability. None of that. Which is a problem because a public order emergency is defined as, being espionage and sabotage and support of this and support of that, just the things that I mentioned up there. So, okay. Number six, most of the resources requested by the Ottawa police had already arrived before the act was invoked. So I hope that we got the last one that I was just saying. Just by the letter of the law, the OPP main guy, intelligence officer in the Ontario Police Department or whatever, said that there was none of those things, espionage, sabotage, all this, that wasn't there. And those are the reasons that you would bring in the Emergencies Act. They weren't there. So that's the reason why you think it was unjustified. Most of the resources requested by the Ottawa police had already arrived before the act was invoked. So you shut down the liberties and do all that because you need these extra powers. Well, actually, no, they didn't. Number seven, there's no evidence that there was any terrorism funding or money laundering in the crowdfunding operation set up to support the people protesting against an increasingly authoritarian government, I might add. The Liberals claim that there was in fact, but there wasn't. That also came out in the committee hearings. So that's one reason I think it's probably unjustified. Another is because Chrystia Freeland insulted the people in the committee hearings by refusing to answer questions. Add to this the fact that they're hiding behind cabinet confidence rather than sharing the evidence and reasoning that went into the decision to invoke the act. Much of the material that has been provided was heavily redacted. If the government felt that the act was justified, they could be more forthcoming in their responses. Number 9, trade between Canada went up during that time, which, because they could say that they had to do it for economic reasons, but in fact trade between Canada and the United States went up while those borders were closed. I didn't agree with the border closures at all, but it's a fact that it didn't affect trade as much as you'd think. So, Commissioner Paul Rouleau needs to come to some harsh conclusions, and the political and journalistic class needs to tell the truth. If they don't, a substantial portion of the country with legitimate grievances and a pretty good understanding of things will properly conclude that the inquiry was a sham, the judge was not impartial, and that the powers that be have no real issue with this sort of abuse of power and therefore have no incentive to prevent it from happening again. That's overstated. But anyway, they'll conclude quite correctly, or, to some percentage correct. They'll conclude that the system is rigged and that journalists and politicians absolutely cannot be trusted. And that will lead to more populist sentiment and action, because that's precisely what populism is. Populism is what you get when the average person looks at the ruling class and thinks they're both incompetent, corrupt, and not doing things in their best interest. I think it's interesting that the act was written to prevent abuses such as occurred under the elder Trudeau when he went overboard with the War Measures Act in response to the October crisis. Like his son, the elder Trudeau was a great admirer of communism, and by implication some of its tactics. Provoking acts of unrest for the sole purpose of suppressing them is something that authoritarians do. He did provoke it, and then he did suppress it. Why else would he insult and slander the protesters with accusations of racism, misogyny, and homophobia? Remember, my original contention is that he knew he didn't need the act, just did it for his own gratification. So doesn't it look like this is what he was trying to do? Why would he come up with all that stuff? Why would he disregard their concerns so completely as to not talk to them once? That had to have been intended to turn up the temperature and provoke a seriously hostile, perhaps violent response, and one that didn't come, thanks to the wisdom and self-control of the truckers. If the protesters were so dangerous as the government claims, these actions serve to only increase the danger to the public and to the parliamentarians. Why would they do that? My guess is that they wanted a more serious incident so that they could demonize their critics and bring law enforcement down on their necks. Here are some other authoritarian-like behaviors they engage in. Corrupting the mainstream media. So I'm saying he behaved like an authoritarian, and now I'm going to give you the other reasons I think he's an authoritarian, not necessarily related to this. Trucker convoy thing. Okay, he corrupts mainstream media. Harsher regimes do this through intimidation and violence. This one did it by corruption and bribery using the taxpayers' own money. In the democratic system, a free press functions ideally to hold governments to account. That function is compromised when journalists are dependent on the very government they're supposed to be scrutinizing. Maybe a little too much commentary. He's demonizing. Here's some examples straight from the horse's mouth. They don't believe in science and progress and are very often misogynistic and racist. It's a very small group of people, but that doesn't shy away from the fact that they take up some space. This leads us as a leader and as a country to make a choice. Do we tolerate these people? That's a famous quote, and it's a very good one. You have to wonder here what not tolerating these people would entail besides jail time, frozen bank accounts, loss of career prospects, educational opportunities, and all of which have already occurred to other people who didn't go along with the woke cause in general. Not that this Yeah, sorry. Um, yeah. Okay. And finally, this old chestnut. The country I admire most is China, which, due to its basic dictatorship, can move quickly on environmental issues. So that quote only becomes more ominous with the passage of time in light of the way that he behaves. He invoked the Emergency Act with very little, if any, justification. That is the sort of thing that authoritarians do. Okay, here's another one, he said. There are still people who refuse to identify as feminists. We need to find these people and deal with them. Okay, that sounds an awful lot like a prime minister who would use repressive measures to ensure that Canadians mouth the correct ideology. It really sounds like that. Sounds an awful lot like a prime minister who would use repressive measures to ensure that Canadians mouth the correct ideology. Here's the example again. There are still people who refuse to identify as feminists. We need to find these people and deal with them. Another thing he does that's like a dictator is he treats himself to endless indulgences. I don't know what it is, but he was spending like $12,000 a month on groceries. They disrespect basic democratic principles such as judicial independence and the rule of law, engages in discriminatory hiring practices, censors, they're at it again with Bill C-11, engages in propaganda. The CBC is practically the propaganda wing of the Liberal Party. Everybody knows this already. Employing agents of the state to suppress the fundamental right of citizens, such as the right to be free from having their assets frozen without due process. That's a big one. The right to peaceful protest. And let's not get started on the rights denied by what some would call overly aggressive lockdowns and mandates. Nobody much disagrees with lockdowns and mandates, but these were excessive. So I've got more examples, but this is getting long. Yeah. I just wanted to give the information about why I think that he did it on purpose. Just he thought he could win votes by cracking down on these people. But maybe I've misjudged that completely. Maybe he really was scared. Maybe it was fear. I think, but it could be both, obviously. So there's fear on the one side, and then the other desire to crack down on these fuckers, right? Of course he'd want to do that. So, yeah, an interesting question. I think it's just how much this protest was about about the lockdowns and mandates, and how much was about sending Justin Trudeau and his woke agenda a giant middle finger. That's something that I haven't heard anybody say about this, is that trucker convoy was a protest against uh, the woke agenda. I doubt that they're, as seriously redneck as you imagine them to be. Like, really. Because I went to the thing, right? And I went to two, and one was they were just gentle as could be, and then the next one was a little rougher. Um, yeah, how much was it about the lockdowns and mandates, and how much of it was just about sending Trudeau and his woke ways a giant middle finger? Yeah, it was a lot. A lot of it was about that. I can promise you that. I know that. My sense is about half and half. Would the convoy have formed if a conservative prime minister had come up with the same policies? That's a good one. Perhaps, but in my opinion, but it would not have had, yeah, it wouldn't have been close to the same rate of participation. And it wouldn't have become famous around the world. Canada was famous. Not on the mainstream shows, but the mainstream quite often loses out to YouTube like it does all the time. So more people were looking at the Canadian truckers as heroes than you might realize unless you'd sought out that kind of information. Canadians were considered absolute heroes for that. It was the biggest trucker convoy ever. and it inspired a bunch of other ones in different parts of the world. Probably the farmers' protests in the Netherlands is, influenced a little bit by that. Okay, so an even more interesting thing to consider, not related to the original question. I think we've sorted out the original question. He wasn't justified in bringing it in. That's been obvious since the committee hearings. Okay, so an even more interesting to consider is the question of whether it would have occurred without the Jordan Petersons of the world. The Dave Rubins and Ben Shapiros, the Mark Steins, the Janice Villamengos, the Gad Sads, all those guys, right? The Joe Rogans and all that. Would that convoy have happened? Forums that pontificate on the perceived flaws of woke politics as a veritable growth industry these days. So, yeah, I mean, that had to have an impact on people's behavior. Whether those guys would have gotten in the trucks without listening to these guys, for the last 5 years, I don't know. I doubt it. Jordan Peterson did comment on it. He said, "You guys are keeping it non-violent. Way to go. That's the most important thing." That was, like, he was asked, and that was the first thing that he said, and he was absolutely correct to say that, the first thing. The horns were a mistake. So the thing is that, okay, because one of the things that they would have been listening to is this whole business about this takedown of diversity, inclusion, and equity policies that, every major industry, every branch of every government, it does this diversity, inclusion, and equity. It's an acronym for DIE. But they are at bottom, they have always been, a bizarre attempt to disenfranchise certain parts of the population. You can't say that it is your idea that you're going to increase the percentage of this kind of person, and that would, unless you're going to hire, what are you going to do, hire indefinitely? And not say that the other group isn't disadvantaged. Of course you're disadvantaging them. It's impossible that you wouldn't be. Those policies disenfranchise. Or they said, they disenfranchise certain parts of the population. Not every member of that part of the population, but a lot of them. Did that understanding help motivate the truckers? I bet it did. As did decades of divorce courts that have brutalized husbands and fathers. Parents losing control over what is taught to their children in school. Immigration policies that seek to bring in 1 million immigrants a year despite the country not having enough homes to house the people already here. And so they're looking at that. That might have been part of their frustration. And now what they've done is they've gone on a huge hiring spree. Every branch of government has done this. Federal, provincial, and municipal governments have gone on this big hiring spree through this whole thing. Can you believe that? We've never been more in debt. And they'd be borrowing money to pay salaries. And these people are going to be unionized and have a right to, really pretty easy ride probably for the rest of their lives, a lot of them. A secure ride anyway. They might have quite difficult jobs. I'm not saying that. So that's about it, I guess, for what that was worth.